struggles for Canadian oil prices. Part of that reflected in the lack of pipeline capacity. Now the CEO of CN Rail is weighing in, confident that his railway can dominate another trend, which is shipping crude through the railroads. Jameson Burke has been tracking that story, joins us here in studio with a few more details. Jameson.
So this is something that wasn't really expected to be much of a business at all, John, as of now, because the expectation was we'd have enough pipeline capacity that we wouldn't have to move a lot of oil on trains. But now that it does seem to be at least a medium-term business possibility, people like JJ Rouet, who I have to say is the CEO of CN Rail, also happens to have a name that just is crying out for its own jingle. I don't know, John, I just keep hearing a little like JJ Rouet in the back of my head every time I hear his name.
Hey, you don't say.
Right.
What do you say, JJ Rouet?
So the guy was born to be an executive just by that alone. So, kudos to Monsieur Rouet's parents for that decision-making process. Certainly seemed to help things along, and he is helping the crude by rail trend along as well. In fact, he told analysts on a conference call yesterday that it's going to be a very solid year for crude by rail in 2019. Could be at a point where CN is the leading railroad for 2019. Now, Eric Nuttall, John, who is one of the more well-known energy investors in this country, told me he had a personal conversation with Monsieur Rouet where he said that there could be as much as 200,000 barrels per day of increased capacity that CN could add to its tracks over the course of the next year, which would nearly double the total amount of Canadian crude moving on railways across the country right now, which is already at a record. But one thing Rouet didn't really touch on is the high costs of increasing that type of capacity. It's something that his crosstown rival, Keith Creel, the head of CP Rail, mentioned. I know we were talking about it actually just the other day, that they're going to have to make very extensive and expensive long-term investments in crude by rail. He doesn't see that kind of runway, but I want to show you some data as well to see just exactly why CN does have the upper hand here. They're already growing huge amounts of, or I should say they're shipping huge amounts of crude on their rail lines. Of course, CN does have a fair bit more track to work with than CP, but just look at the year-over-year change. You can see the growth rates are much more significant. This data, John, is from actually up until the end of last week, October 20th.
The other thing we've talked about this before, but when it comes to building pipelines, there's a very public debate of whether we should see more or less. Is there the same conversation around crude by rail? Because it's always possible you could see some kind of incident when you're shipping oil using a rail line.
That's a really good question, because the answer is no, but because just by looking at the rhetoric on social media and in the news, there isn't really a lot of op-eds being written saying we don't need more crude by rail. I imagine that if you were to ask people, you'd probably get a fairly passionate range of opinion. But you're absolutely right to point out pipelines are designed and situated to be as far away from human activity as possible, whereas it's the exact opposite case with railways, as we learned quite tragically with the Lac-Mégantic disaster about nearly 6 years ago now. So the challenge becomes, how do you balance that risk, especially given the fact that once new pipelines are built, and most analysts and experts believe it's not a matter of if, but when, as these continual delays are just that, delays, not real death sentences for these pipelines, that all of these expensive investments that railways would have to make in terms of more locomotives, more specific rail cars that are uniquely designed to hold crude oil, that all those investments might be for naught if, say, 5 years from now, we're looking at a world that has not just the Trans Mountain Pipeline operating, but also Keystone XL.
Pretty tough, I would think, to just plan for that long-term possibility or uncertainty, but that's why they get paid the big bucks. Now, in Alberta, we know that Rachel Notley has been pretty vocal on this issue of getting pipelines built. On the subject of crude by rail, what has she been saying?
She's getting to really throw a little more political capital behind that trend, John, and she does acknowledge that it's at best a medium-term solution, but even that seems to be a particularly long-term trend, just like the long-term downward trend we've seen in Western Canada Select. That's the most common grade of crude oil produced in Northern Alberta. She wants more cars, she wants more locomotives to get more filled with Alberta crude. She calls that the bottom line, John, but here's my bottom line, which is maybe, a few notches lower than hers, because I've looked at the data. There are hundreds of locomotives. CP alone has 400 locomotives sitting just idling because they don't need them right now. But when people look at this as an issue in terms of increasing capacity, there is a finite amount of trains that can run on the tracks that are built in Canada. And short of building entirely new sets of tracks, which is absolutely cost prohibitive, there will be a limit that the industry will hit. Maybe that is after doubling capacity, but even that, we're talking about maybe a quarter or at best a third of what one new pipeline can move.
Okay, well, watch and see. I got distracted at the end because I started thinking if there was...
But we never get a chance to talk about crude and rail pipelines.
But my cap is around 3 minutes. It's very informative, Jameson, but I was just trying to think, is there something that rhymes with Jameson Burko? Like, do you have the J.J. Rouet?
See, and you have the Bimenin kind of thing, John Ehrlichman. It's one extra syllable, which is kind of tough, but I think I made it work there.
Okay, thank you for
Yeah.
shedding some light.
It's going to be in your head for
the show.
decades.
Jameson Burko coming up in the